Hey, listen, I hope you enjoy this episode of the Antisocial Podcast. I understand you're probably wondering whose voice this is. So, hello, my name's JB, and I love to write big, heavy riffs with big power metal choruses, and I call it Fierce Deity, which, after you're done here, I invite you to check out. Which you can do by finding me all over social media at Fierce Deity Band, or simply head to fiercedeityband.com. Anyway, enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Antisocial Podcast, and this episode is proudly brought to you by these legends. Thank you very much to Andrew from Perth, Mick G from Sydney, Ash from Deniliquin, Dan from Dapto, Rod from Rayleigh in North Carolina, Patrick from Canberra, Liam from Brisbane, Chris from Sydney, Brendo from Leeton, Tim from Canberra, James from Brisbane, Christian from Canberra, and Steve from the Gold Coast. These legends are my top tier supporters over at Patreon, part of the larger community of legends who are backing your mate Andy and his little old podcast, the Antisocial Podcast. Support starts from only $1 a month, dirt cheap, set and forget, and there are additional tiers if you want access to exclusive things such as podcasts, free merch, the lot, heaps of stuff over at patreon.com/Andy Dowling. Get behind it, support your mate. So 272 of the Antisocial Podcast is here, and my guest on this episode is an Australian metal legend. And yes, guys, I understand I use the word legend way too often. Basically, I call anybody I love and adore a legend. But in this case, it's especially fitting because I've got Chris Rand, who is best known as the frontman from the band Segression on the podcast. And what an amazing guy. I've known Chris for a few years and have played some shows with the guys. And he's just an amazing guy who has achieved so much over the course of his life, not just Segression. And as you'll discover in this chat, if you don't know Chris, you're going to learn a lot more about him. He's a professional tattoo artist. He is a machine of a runner and has just dabbled in so many different things over the years. And we only scrape the surface in this chat. I mean, really, I need to do a few more episodes with Chris just to dig in deeper into his world. But an amazing guy, and Segression were absolutely iconic in the Australian metal scene for quite a number of years. Played with some of the biggest bands in the world, and just an incredible band that has left an amazing legacy for everybody to enjoy. So I'm going to have links to Segression, to Chris, to his tattoo studio. Everything in the show notes will be over at antisocial.net and andydowling.net. So you guys know what I'm going to say. Enough crapping on from me. Please enjoy this great chat with Chris Rand. And I thought maybe a cool place to start is the first time I ever saw you guys play live. And that was 2001 at Festival Hall in Brisbane, supporting Pantera and Corrosion of Conformity. And long before I knew who you guys were, this is the first experience I ever had. I saw the name around, and I remember you guys rocked up in the afternoon, and we were all, when you're back in the day, you're young and you're waiting outside and you want to be first to the barrier and all that sort of stuff. And so we were out there mid-afternoon, and you guys rocked up in a taxi. And, my favourite bands at the time was barely Metallica and, the Big Four and stuff like that. And I thought, who's this band who's just rocked up in a taxi? That doesn't look terribly professional.
That's what we could afford.
Oh, don't worry. And then years later, fast forward a few years later, I mean, I realised and had the slap of reality of what being in a band was all about. But please, indulge me. What was that experience like, whether it be Brisbane or any of those shows on that tour with Pantera? I mean, obviously an iconic band, and the last time that they ever came out here. What are some immediate thoughts that you have from that time?
Well, I was a massive Pantera fan, and at the time we'd just come off a couple of other big tours, and the band was really cracking along at the top of at the peak of our powers, and we were in America, and they offered us the tour to come back to Australia, and we had to really toss up because we were doing things in America that we didn't think possible at the time, and we were enjoying ourselves and recording and touring, and but the offer of Pantera was just too much to pass up, and we were a little bit homesick. It'd been our first sort of extended time away. I had a wife and daughter at the time. I'd been out of home for 3.5, 4 months over there, so it was a good opportunity. I thought, well, Pantera is one of my favourite bands, and come back to Australia and do that would be awesome, and then at the same time get to catch up with our families and reassess where we're at. And we were going to do the Pantera tour, do some more songwriting and head back to America in the September, lo and behold, a couple of planes hit some buildings and everything changed. So that's kind of it. It was it was definitely a changed experience to what we had in mind. But back to the Pantera tour, I was so excited because I was such a big Pantera fan, and when I met the band, I had really mixed emotions, to be honest. Phil and Rex were sort of very indulged in substances and very opinionated views that that probably personally I didn't hold. So I was a little bit disappointed when I met those guys. But on the flip side, Vinny and Dime were absolute gems to meet, and they were a pleasure to be around. So it's real mixed. The actual tour was really good for us. We got such good crowd response, and the experience of seeing one of your favourite bands on stage, whether you agree with everything they have to say or not, is something that I'll cherish.
It was certainly a surreal experience, and as like a young music fan, still trying to learn, who's who in the metal world, I remember just being in awe, like getting ready for. I was even a fan of Corrosion, which was quite surprising because a lot of people in the crowd like had no idea who they were, and I must have just got lucky, and I think it might have been some Metallica sort of links with Corrosion where I sort of discovered them. But that sort of anticipation of waiting for them to get on stage and being such a small fry in the pit with a bunch of big burly sort of bearded weed smoking metalheads, from the burbs, it's sort of like, oh geez, I'm really out of my depth here. But I remember, certainly mixed emotions coming out of that as well for me. It was amazing to see a band that, you would never think you could see play, and I was way too young the last times they were coming out, and but yes, I remember Phil just being he wasn't there, he was somewhere else, and he fell off the stage, and he had this big long rant on stage for like 10 minutes or something like that, and it was just dribble, but it was very, as you said, very opinionated and not the popular opinions. And it was a very weird vibe at times. So it was, and especially it's funny now because so many years later, in the way that the world is now, looking back just to see how polarizing things were back then. Even back then compared to now as well. So it's definitely a very interesting time. But it's a very fond memory that I have, and seeing you guys play and discovering like who this band is, and it was really, really cool. But one thing I wanted to ask you, because I won't stay on Pantera for much longer, but you mentioned sort of being in the States, and one thing that I didn't realise until about a week ago when I was doing a bit of digging around the internet is that you guys had actually relocated to the US, to Chicago, I believe. And
it was on Lake Michigan, so about 2 hours from Chicago. But we did spend time in Chicago as well. But we were living in a little town called Grand Haven, which is right next to Grand Rapids, Muskegon area of Lake Michigan. It was
wow,
and really cold.
Oh, I can only imagine. So was the plan to go over there for a set period of time, or was it a case of just? It sounds a bit reckless, but like sort of a one-way sort of ticket sort of scenario, and then assess after you've done a few milestones and then work out what you're going to do after that. What was the game plan going into that? Because that's a big move. Obviously you guys were riding some momentum at the time, but did you have sort of an idea of what that period of time was going to look like for you guys?
We did not know what we were in store for over there, but what had happened is we'd done a tour with Slipknot, who was a fresh band at the time. When they first came out, it was still all the hype about what they look like without masks, and a different time to what it is now. And their tour manager really, really liked us. He liked what we stood for. He liked us as people. He liked the music. He liked the songs. He liked the live show. And he basically got back in touch with his high school friend, who was like a seed investor who invested in lots of different bands. He's one of the wealthiest guys in America, inherited wealth from like his family, and so he was playing money into bands left, right, and centre just to see what he could do. And he heard our stuff. He went off the recommendation of his friend and offered us to come over and learn and grow and do some shows and see what would eventuate from there. So we did, And within a couple of shows, he had some amazing marketing behind him and some amazing ideas. We weren't on the correct visa at the time, so we were allowed to play over there, but we weren't allowed to earn income.
Right.
So when we got paid, we'd actually get paid in $1 US bills, and then we would throw them up in the air, and these two enormous fans would blow the money onto the crowd. So you could imagine within 2 or 3 shows, we were packing out everywhere.
I bet.
And then we ended up playing with Hatebreed,
Wow, cool.
one of the big venues over there called the Intersection, a really famous club in Michigan. And they turned up. Funnily enough, my memory of the whole thing was they turned up and they didn't even have any gear with them because they were on tour with Soulfly or Sepultura at the time. I can't quite remember, and Shadows Fall, and so all their show gear was on the big tour, and they were doing these side shows. So they turned up with no gear and basically said, "What have you got?" And we just all shared gear, and it was packed out, and it was such a good vibe. And I seen a poster on the wall for Killing Heidi.
Wow.
And they played there on the Tuesday, and we went to watch them, and there was like just us in the club, and Killing Heidi were at the peak of their powers in Australia at the time, and they had like a handful of people watching them in the Intersection, and then we played with Hatebreed, and we were so grateful, and due to some of the inventive marketing that we had over there, we were playing to absolutely chock-a-block rooms, which is it all felt really weird.
I mean, what an amazing sort of marketing sort of strategy of just going, okay, there's a loophole here. I mean, we can't pay you guys, so let's invest that money into the marketing, into the crowd, literally. I mean, it's such a great idea. And I mean, what was the call with? I mean, once you guys are over there, obviously, not knowing exactly what you're going to be walking into, did you guys collectively before you went over there have a chat and say, look, let's do a minimum of 2-3 months or whatever, reassess and go from there? I mean, because this is a big thing, and no doubt by that stage you guys, you've got families or starting to get families, you're starting to get those commitments, the things that traditionally bog a band down or slow them down. What was the sort of the game talk between all of you guys at the time?
Let's just ride this and go and do everything we can to play and do what we love doing and try not to kill each other along the way. So we shacked up in a little place in Michigan and just worked and rehearsed and wrote songs and toured and played and lived it for 3.5, 4 months. And we weren't in any immediate hurry to come home. We were coping quite well. We were a little bit homesick. But then the Pantera offer was just, you just said, right, we're going to go back and do that. And then we'll finish writing and come back in the September, because I think that was in the May from memory. But we are going back now 20 years. So if my months are slightly out, it's because I'm getting a bit older myself.
Yeah, no, you could be right. May, might be about right. So obviously the events that happened in September of that year, naturally would put a halt to any plans that anybody has. Was it a case of just there was a window there that you guys had that plan, and with that window gone, and from what I can recall, the world got sort of turned upside down for quite some time after that. Was it just a case that you guys sort of just didn't find that opening again because of what had happened and just lost that sort of that opportunity to get back over?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what happened. And then musical genres sort of come in and go out again. And so we reassessed what we were doing here, and some of the directions that we were given from the Americans we didn't feel necessarily was what we were about. So we wrote the Side Effect X album because there was talk of us actually adding a vocalist and going a little bit more down the Linkin Park avenue if we did go back to America, which we didn't see as being us, but we had a heap of songs written along those lines. So we released that under the different band name then.
Obviously reading online can sort of see a little bit of sort of how that was digested, but for you guys, I mean, what was that experience like? Obviously getting some, from a creativity point of view, getting some different stuff out there, but I mean, what was that period of time like in reflection?
It was fantastic because that was, we were really put to work all of the tools that we'd gathered up to that point. So we'd really then started to get our head around recording techniques, and it enabled us to build our own studio. And the engineer, who was a young guy who actually started out, that was his second recording, I believe, because he did something with Cog first and another band, maybe 3 Point Tilt. Then he worked on the Side Effect X album. He's got on to win an ARIA and work with everyone from North Lane to Tonight Alive is the band I'm thinking of. Yeah, he's worked with lots of young bands, and he's carved out a massive career at Electric Sun Studios in Sydney. And at the time, he was working out of his bedroom recording the side project to Segression, and then we built a studio based on what he was going to build for himself, and it just all went different direction to probably what we were thinking, but it's been amazing the entire time. We did have a little breather after all that, so we had a little break away from music just to refresh.
So going back quite a few years earlier, I mean, I actually, funnily enough, I was going to talk about Easy, and I found one of it must have been the EP. I found that in an op shop years ago, and just flicking through and going, what's this band? And so I'm having a look and looking inside the booklet, and I'm like, oh, that name rings a bell. I think I know that person. and I didn't, and it was down your way, down the south coast, and I didn't realize the connection. So obviously doing a bit more digging could understand sort of, the path to lead up to where we were just talking about then. But going back to sort of those earlier days, I mean, what was, correct me if I'm wrong, but have you always been based in Wollongong?
Yes, we have. There was one pivotal moment where, I'll give you the lead up to Easy. Me and Sven, we were just young guys playing in bands and playing around pubs and playing parties to our friends, and just basically learning our instruments and stumbling along as we were only teenagers at the time. And this local band was almost like a Kiss Motley Crue style covers band, but they had a few originals, and they were quite popular at the time. They were packing out all the clubs in Wollongong, and they had a lineup shift where a couple of members left, so they were looking for a bass player. So I joined. I'd started off in a little band that opened for them that mainly played Metallica and Anthrax covers, to be honest, and a little bit of the Cult and them, that era of music. And they asked me if I would learn their set, and I found going from playing like Metallica, early Metallica and Anthrax, to playing Kiss, it was, I could do it, so no problem. It felt a little strange not playing as busily, but I still enjoyed it. Music's music to me. So I joined, and then shortly thereafter the lead guitarist left, and then Sven came in. And it was obvious then that when Sven joined me in a band environment instead of just jamming together, that we were on the same sort of, direction musically. So we were pushing for this band Easy to get heavier and heavier, and started off doing some backing vocals to try and beef up the lead vocalist's voice, and ended up culminating where the lead vocalist ended up leaving along with one of the other guitarists, and we kind of morphed into what Segression became. It was quite aware by the time we'd written Easy Rise from Darkness that Easy was not going to be the band name that fit us, and we sort of ended up changing it to Segression, and Sven's promise to help me on the vocals never eventuated, and I just ended up being the guy stuck with the job.
There's so many stories like that where people have no intention whatsoever to get in front of that mic or be the main person in front of the mic, and then just out of circumstance and nobody else putting up their hand, just find themselves there, but ends up becoming a critical part of the band and becoming an iconic part of what the band becomes. So yeah, it's I always love hearing those stories, because it's never the intentional path, it's always the falling into a situation.
Yeah, and I never intended to be a metal singer either, if I'm honest. It was just what my voice sounded like by the time I got over the noisy drums and the even louder guitars. I found myself having to be that guy because the music was so aggressive. But I guess if you're in a band and you're all saying the same thing, it kind of works. So I stuck with it. And the common thing that happens to me a lot, and you probably have this, maybe a similar experience having met me in the real world as opposed to the social media world, is I'm quite quietly, softly spoken. I'm almost shy, and I'm not very big either. So I commonly get how do you do what you do in Segression when you're this little quiet guy? And then it's like you're this monster on stage, and it's like, well, I guess there's a switch that kind of comes in and you just turn it on to do what you do.
Go into character.
Yeah, sort of. It's definitely a part of my personality. I definitely have that, that inner strength and belief to put what I do in the band out there, and it's real. It's not so much clicking into a character and being something different. I do have that emotion within me, but there is definitely a difference between me in my everyday role and me on stage.
When during the easy days and even sort of leading up to them, what was the wollongong sort of live scene like at the time? Because for me, I moved down to sort of Sydney, and obviously the band was based in Wollongong at the time, and that was sort of late 2005, early 2006. So really prior to that, I've got no idea apart from stories. But
man, it was fantastic. Like, you play it like a little youth center, and there'd be sweat dripping off the ceiling because there were so many people there, and we end up pulling people and having complete like stage invasions and crowd surfing and slamming pits. And it was in the days where I guess people weren't so afraid of being sued, because there was some crazy moments on stage with equipment flying all over the place and people diving left, right, and center, and it was just a good time. And people were out there to enjoy themselves. It's obviously, with the current state of affairs, something that you can't even imagine what it was like, because at the moment we're hard pressed to even shake hands with people anymore. So, but yeah, it was just crazy. It was every time you play, there'd just be a room full of people all looking to have fun, and we always played on like mixed bills. So we'd have like a punk band playing with us, and like a rock band, and then metal, and it seemed to work all the time. It wasn't like we must all be the same power metal genre or black metal genre, or we don't have a bill together. It was all about just music and people coming out and having fun. And I think the crowds really enjoyed the diversity of having different lineups. And it's almost like it then carried on to when they had festivals where there was these big outdoors events with all sorts of different bands on them. Well, that's what it was like in the wollongong scene. You'd have like these crazy shows with all different styles playing together.
And was it a case where a lot of the shows, you mentioned youth centres, were the majority of the shows at the time all ages sort of affairs, or was it a mixture of sort of doing some sort of pub style gigs as well?
Yeah, it was all over the place. It was pub gigs. There was just lots of gigs. It was live music was something that everyone couldn't get enough of. But then you had a very strong music scene. You had a lot of bands like Screaming Jets that were getting played on television and on radio, and people going out to see them, and the Choir Boys and Noiseworks and Jimmy Barnes, and then I guess then it was like the precursor to all of the metal bands that ended up cracking mainstream. It was just prior to that where Triple J started playing bands like ourselves and Mortality and Cryogenic, where it sort of just the heavy bands started to creep a bit more mainstream with the exposure. And then obviously the next generation of metal bands that come along after us, like the Parkway Drives, just really kicked it, and really opened the doors for everybody.
So at the time, sort of, looking sort of in the early to mid 90s, was the gong part of the touring circuit sort of from a national point of view? So were you guys getting a lot of interstate bands coming through and using wollongong as a stepping stone? if they're going to play up in Sydney and maybe going out to Canberra or going down the coast, would they stop through and play wollongong?
Absolutely. As well? Absolutely. Bands like Dream Killers and Toe to Toe, they'd come through Wollongong. I mean, one of our early shows was us supporting Machine Head, and there was shows with Biohazard at Waves. And
really? Wow. That's cool.
The Slayer even played there, so
Slayer played at Waves?
Yeah, absolutely.
I had no idea. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm sure there'd be a bunch of metalheads listening now.
Alice in Chains played there too.
Wow.
It was just awesome. Waves was a huge venue back in the day.
Wow, incredible. I'm sure there's a bunch of metalheads listening to me now going, how did you not know that, Andy? But because I've only been there, I think I've only been there a couple of times, and that's since moving down to Sydney, whatever it was 15 odd years ago. So I think one thing that's really interesting about Wollongong, and I'm sure there's other parts of the country where you've got sort of the next large town outside of the capital city, but Wollongong is one of those places where really piqued my interest going into the mall, walking around town, and just noticing how many metal fans are out and about. And I think it seems to be a generational thing where a lot of these guys that I would bump into sort of walking around town wearing Anthrax shirts and, like nuclear assault t-shirts, like just stuff that you would never expect to see. And realizing that their parents or their dad was going to gigs back in the 90s or the late 80s and things like that. And so there was sort of, because of the things that you just described, it sort of solidified a lot of fans of heavy music at that time where it was more accepted in this sort of area. And it was for me, I was living in Brisbane at the time, and it was just a different world. I didn't see it as much as I noticed it when I was in Wollongong, and it was just such a big eye-opener. But it kind of makes sense when, like, just listening to your stories and other people who've described sort of the 90s going into the 2000s of what the gong was like and sort of those opportunities and the bands that sort of came out of that area.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you go back even a little bit further from when I was, before my time even in Wollongong, because I came over here when I was a kid. I immigrated with my parents from Wales. But if you go back, like, I don't know if you're aware of Shell Harbour Workers Club.
Yep.
It's a little bit south of Wollongong. Well, from my understanding, Iron Maiden have played there.
Yeah, that's right.
So, this town has its roots in a working class, hard-working, culture. And the heavier music seems to be entrenched in that sort of ideology. And even AC/DC played in like Coromel RSL or something when they were first starting out. So it's always had its roots in that way. And then what I'm describing to you, my experience, is just an expansion of all that, and just a natural evolution.
It's just I'm sure there no doubt are stories in say Geelong or even aspects of Newcastle and probably other parts around the country. So those semi-regional sort of towns, that larger towns outside of the capitals. But yeah, it's just it's fascinating to hear sort of the links along the way of how things got to where they were. And I think also having probably the steelworks there as well, I think that really sort of solidified that working class culture where it's there's no buts about it. I mean, working class sort of completely is attached to heavy metal and heavy music. There's so many sort of parallels, and it's a like-minded approach, lifestyle and all sorts of things that just sort of make sense, and it can be identifiable for people that, traditional blue-collar workers or just the working class in general. So I think having that sort of heavy culture in Wollongong anyway sort of was just primed to embrace music in general.
Yeah, 100%. I remember being underage and my dad taking me to Shell Harbour Workers Club to watch George Thorogood and the Destroyers.
Oh, yeah.
And to this day, I haven't seen a show where it was so violent and so rough and so intimidating. That I don't really scare from things. I just don't have that in my personality. But I remember being fearful at that show when I was underage and seeing all these, like biker sort of guys watching that sort of show. It was just like, and then it erupted, and it was just like, Jesus Christ, what is this? And I kind of liked it, and I was kind of afraid at the same time. It was probably the same emotion as what you got when you said you went to watch Pantera.
Oh yeah. There was just there's a particular energy in the room where just it's almost like there's a gas leak and someone could just light a match and poof, and everything's gonna fire up. And
yeah, it's energy. It's just pure energy.
But it's funny, isn't it? Because if you're talking about stereotypical bands that would have a show with sort of a violent or sort of very sort of volatile, sort of energetic crowd, you certainly wouldn't be thinking of them. But I mean, I've told stories on the podcast a bunch of times over the years where, like, one of the most violent, it's a sort of uneasy sort of shows that I've ever been to was Jimmy Barnes at the Enmore Theatre. And just being there with a bunch of people who were probably double my age. And as soon as Barnesy came on stage, everyone got up. There was guys taking their shirts off. There was, wild turkey cans getting thrown around the room. And it was absolutely feral. And my now wife and I would just stand there just going, oh my God, like, are we in the right place? Like, I mean, this is awesome that Barnesy's on stage. It's a great show, but we're paying more attention to the ferals around us who are just going off.
Yep.
And people sort of, slamming into each other and starting, the fisticuffs are starting to happen as well. And it's just like, oh my God, like you see little hints of this at metal shows every once in a while, but really,
Yeah, no,
the
not
metalheads
the
are
same
just,
vibe.
it's a different vibe altogether.
Yeah,
So
they'll pick you up if you fall down.
that's it. And I think the other thing with the difference probably between the crowds, and just, obviously talking very stereotypically in a general sense, is I think some of these crowds that are going to, Barnsley or anything like that, people that probably don't get out as often as they used to. And so they're saving up, not so much money, but their energy for these events. And so when they're not going to half-ass this. They're going to go to town. They're going to pre-drink. They're going to go out and have a good time beforehand. Then they're going to rock up loose, and then they're just going to go hard, because they know that this is probably the first time or the last time for the next 3-6 months before they're allowed to do it again. And I think
right.
And I think for metalheads, I think it's part of our lifestyle, and we love going to shows, and it could be a weekly affair or a couple of times a month or whatever it might be, and it's just. And as a community, I think you've also got some accountability. You know the people that you're bumping into at shows, so you can't really afford to be too much of a fuckwit.
That's right, and it's even more so now with social media, because the moment that you even remotely hint at being one of those, you're going to get named and shamed and called out and all the rest of it.
Definitely.
But yeah, it's definitely, there's more of a community in the metal scene that I've experienced anyway. Is you go to a Jimmy Barnes show, and 9 times out of 10, not everybody's going to know half the people there. You go to a metal show and everybody sort of goes, "I remember you."
Yeah, definitely. What was the sort of turning, or not the turning point, but what was the light bulb moment for you when it came to heavy music in general? Like as a kid, was it your parents sort of into sort of rock music, or was there a sibling, or just somebody who sort of exposed you to something that would sort of get you eventually onto the path of metal music?
I don't have any siblings. I grew up by myself, so I spent a lot of time just listening to music. My dad always had like records playing, and cassettes, and it was always Black Sabbath, and it was always the heavier music. He was massive into the Rolling Stones as well, so I was always exposed to the heavier sounding bands, and I think it was more of a progression. I guess I heard like early Metallica come out, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. And then the next time something else would come out and be, like an Anthrax come along, and wow, this is taking it a little bit more further. And then a Pantera would come along, or a Slayer would come along, and it was just each time it got that little bit more intricate, that little bit heavier. And it was more a case of if you started off listening to Black Sabbath, and then you can listen to Metallica, you can listen to the next step in metal, and before you know, you listen to Morbid Angel and Deicide and Strapping Young Lad, and you're understanding everything that's going on. Where if you go back and like play a Strapping Young Lad record to someone who hasn't been exposed to metal before, it's too much for them.
Yeah.
It's often like, what is this? This is just noise. I can't differentiate anything. So with me, I think there wasn't so much a big light bulb moment for my listening and my wanting to be into metal. It sort of was gradual, and I'd always been exposed to it. I mean, I was a little kid and my dad would play like rock records really loud, so I was always used to hearing big guitars, and he wasn't so much playing like soft jazz or classical or even blues to me. It was always the more abrasive sounding records. So I was always exposed to it. So when it come time for me to play, I was always trying to play the harder stuff. You'd learn like Smoke on the Water, and then pretty soon you want your fingers to move faster, and you want to be able to get around the fretboard, and you want to know more things, you want to learn more scales, and you want to teach yourself so you can play as good as you can play. And that's where metal came in for me. At the same time, being a bass player, I had like a big interest in like the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Stu Hamm and technical players as well. So I sort of had the two things going on at once from a musician's point of view. Then when I hooked up with other musicians, it was where I kind of just fell into that role that we were talking about earlier, where everything was noisy and loud. So it just got more and more aggressive with wanting to play more difficult things. But then in terms of like a music career, if you can call playing in bands for a length of time a career, there was one pivotal moment for Segression, and it was we went down to Melbourne to play a gig for $50. Which is like, we've been offered a gig in another state. This is huge for us. $50, and we go on, guess what time we go on at 1:45 in the morning for $50, and we were so excited to do it. So we got down there early, and we got our gear out, ready to set up as soon as we could set up. And we didn't realize we were playing in a pub next door to a big venue. And I honestly, to this day, I can't remember which one it is. It might have been in St Kilda, it might have been in Melbourne Centre. But where I'm going with it is, we were playing the Graveyard Shift in a pub where there was actually a metal gig next door. And the metal gig was for a band called Deicide. At the time, they were quite controversial because Glenn Benton had an inverted crucifix burnt into his forehead.
Yeah, that's right.
So the Jimmy Barnes Brigade must have turned up that night to watch Deicide, because after about 3 songs, someone chucked a full can of VB at Glenn Benton's head, and he walked off stage and never returned, which left an entire venue that was packed for a controversial band like that with nowhere to go except the pub next door and a bunch of kids that knew about 6 or 7 songs. So we played our 6 or 7 songs 3 or 4 times and played covers that we'd only talked about in the car on the way down there, and had a jolly good time because it was packed out for hours. And the promoter at the time was so happy that we everyone had a great time, and the night was not completely saved, but it had a little bit more of a positive spin on it for the crowd. That he then said, that was so good of you guys to give us a couple extra bucks, petrol money, and some drinks and stuff. And he said, I'm going to really look after you guys. I've heard about you, and you're a really nice bunch of guys, and to play like that and to keep going, and and you came down here for $50. I'm going to look after you. And the next thing he did was give us an opening slot for Machine Head at Waves.
Wow.
In our hometown. And that's really where it began for us. We practiced really hard. And the funny thing was, it was like the universe had some sort of plan for it all, because Machine Head kicked out Chris Kontos just before they left to come on their first Australian tour. Wow. So they only knew about 6 or 7 songs themselves. Wow. So when it got time to come play in Wollongong, they were like, yeah, can you guys play for a bit longer than us? Because we've got Walter Ryan from Madball, who's a punk drummer, having learnt as many songs as he can on the plane in headphones. So can you guys, get us out of a jam and play a bit longer, because it's your hometown? And and we did. And by getting the promoter out of that, and we actually hit it off with the guys in Machine Head, and they went back and told all their friends that we were a good bunch of boys and get us to play with them when they come out there. So then we toured with Fear Factory, and we got offered other supports and just kicked on from there. So that VB can at Glenn Benton's head is my little light bulb moment that you're probably talking about in a different light.
Love it. I'm just picturing someone with a T-shirt now of like a flying VB can just going at Glenn's head, and you can just say like the moment the world changed. I love it.
For Segression.
Yeah. And I think the cool thing about it, I mean, it's probably a little bit of a lesson as well, is that probably not from a business point of view, it's not the best decision to be, sort of going interstate for a $50 gig. But obviously, I think when you're starting out or in the infancy stages of a band, it's not about sort of the money. It's about sort of getting out and taking the opportunities as they come and being a good sport about it, and just sort of rolling with it and being flexible. And I just remember years and years ago as a kid, and just something would go wrong and someone would say to me, "Oh, well, that's rock and roll." In other words, just suck it up and roll with it. It's okay.
Yeah.
And I've always sort of kept that in mind when things, when the rails, when it comes off the rails, and you sort of go, oh, okay, what do we do? And you watch people sort of just tense up, and they become rigid, and they don't want to be flexible with anything that happens, and they're the people that often get left behind. So obviously, just the fact that you guys were good sports, as you said, I mean, that just led to one opportunity after another. And I mean, I love that stuff. I think it's so cool, because obviously you guys musically, no doubt at the time, you were doing good stuff anyway, but obviously having the additional layer of your reputation and being reliable and good guys just separates you further from any other candidates that might have been considered.
Yeah, I like I said to Sven the other day, I was like, I'm not really a religious person. I don't like to speak of religion, but I am a very spiritual person. And at the same time, because I've studied extensively, I'm quite intellectual. But what it comes down to for me is, if you use your logic and your intellect all the time, all you're doing is trying to continually solve problems or avoid or embrace situations. But if you look at everything that comes your way as an opportunity or a place to learn from or somewhere to grow to, by using your spiritual connection, you're going to have a better time of things.
Makes sense. Makes sense. It's sort of like, the glass half full perspective, looking at something and going, well, what can I get out of the situation? The situation might initially be shocking and uncomfortable and not be what you had in mind and what your mind was fixed on. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a write-off. What it actually might lead to an opportunity and might lead to something even better than what you initially had planned in your mind.
It's the only time you grow. Is you don't grow from the good times. You don't grow from like all of the things that go well for you. You tend to grow and learn from all the things that you've got to overcome.
Have you had other times, whether it be band or outside of band, where you sort of been at that moment where you've been challenged and you sort of used it as an opportunity?
I throw myself into things all the time just to do that. A few years ago, I had a really, really unusual situation happen where I was bullied a little bit into being called tubby, and I was probably starting to put on a little bit of weight here and there. So I thought, well, I'm going to take up running and fitness, and I'm going to see where that takes me. So I started jogging, and I jogged around the block and did a couple of things. Then I found that it was a challenge to me to see how far I could run or how fast I could run or different challenges. So in the end, I joined a running club and I met a couple of people, and they really pointed me in the direction of exercise and running and how it can be really good for your mind. And I had this experience where one of the guys in my running club was an older gentleman, and he sort of mentored me. And at the time I thought, right, I'm going to try and qualify for one of the biggest races around the world, which is the Boston Marathon. So he took me under his wing, give me a heap of advice, because once you start doing 42-kilometer runs, there's a fair bit of knowledge that goes into not hurting yourself. Yeah. So what happened, on the Sunday he messaged me and gave me some advice, and he was looking forward to seeing my result. But by the Wednesday, he'd passed away. Now, the year before, I'd already qualified for Boston, but I was trying to, redo it again, because when I'd qualified for Boston, I'd taken my father-in-law to a doctor's appointment. He had diagnosed with a heart condition, so we cancelled our trip and didn't go to Boston. So I was trying to re-qualify, so he gave me advice on how to back it up and how to do it better, and I took this guy's advice. Anyway, the race was on the same weekend as Boston, and it was in Canberra. So I'm running this race and I'm doing everything that this guy told me to do. I even had like an embroidered patch on with his name on it. I ran the race for him, thinking of him all the way. And I got towards the finish line, and I was wearing a GPS watch at the time. And if you press stop on any sort of watch, everything stops. With a GPS, it's got your distance, the time, the speed that you're running. It's got all these different functions. For some reason, my watch stopped on a particular time. It was 2:54. And everything else had kept going. The distance was still going, my pace was still going, but this time function on the watch had locked on. So I go back to my room. I crossed the finish line, or before I got back to the room, crossed the finish line, grabbed the medal for me, stuck it in my knickers, grabbed a second medal so that I could give one to his wife at the funeral. When I got back to my room, I seen an email on my computer, and it said a list of all of Eric, who's my mentor's, best times, and his best time was 2:54, and it was on the Canberra course. Wow. Which is, my watch had stuck on that time. Now, this is only where the story starts to get half interesting. It's a bit of a long one, but
no, go for it.
I couldn't believe myself, and then my wife and kids always come and watch me, and they always stand at a specific spot at the finish line, so I don't have to think after 42 Ks, where are they? I know where to look at the finish line. They're off to the right and back a couple hundred meters. So I look there and I see them, give them a wave. Now, I was going to go to Boston the year before, as I said, but my father-in-law was diagnosed with a heart condition, which turned out to be a false diagnosis. But I didn't go, and the race that I qualified in this time was on the same day as Boston. It was the same time that the bombs went off in Boston for the race that I was meant to have been there for. Now, I qualified for it, so I was going to go the next year anyway. So I qualified, but it was the same weekend. Now, if you Google this, is the first person who passed away from the bombs was Karen Rand, and that's my wife's name.
Oh.
And she didn't actually die, and Karen Rand isn't my wife's real name. It's a business name.
Mm.
But the person holding Karen Rand's purse passed away from the bombs, and I was meant to be at that race. So I went the following year. I fulfilled my dream to compete there, and I went the year after the bombs. And my wife and kids were at the finish line where I told them to stand, and someone come up to them and said, "Do you realise you're standing in the exact spot someone died when that bomb went off?"
Oh, God.
Now, there is that much detail in that story. There is no way that I can make up any of that, and you can Google it, you can look it all up. And so that only reaffirms my spirituality of what is meant for you is meant for you. And then coming back all the way around to your initial question is, when I come back from Boston, I got pulled over for speeding in my car on the way home from the airport. I wasn't speeding. I fought the speeding ticket in court myself, no representation. I won. And when I won, the judge more or less told me that I'd handled myself so well in the district court without representation, I should think of a career.
Yeah.
So I went back to school and got another 3 uni degrees. So the Boston Marathon really sort of chucked me in a different direction. And that's what I said to you in the beginning. I throw myself into these situations now because I find that I grow and learn and have a much more fulfilling life from it.
Oh, mate, may as well end the podcast now. I don't think we can get any better than that. Far out. I mean, before all this happened, you've said a couple of times that this is, you're a spiritual person, not really religious or anything like that, but just believing that there's other things going on. Did you have that same sort of feelings beforehand, and it was merely sort of reinforced and amplified when all these events happened? Or was it more of a case of when all of this happened, it was just too hard to ignore, and it sort of put you into a different mindset of just looking at life in a completely different way?
Yeah, look, I think I've always been kind of awake. I've always been aware of things. Like, I always had like little premonitions and little, things that I always thought, fuck, that's a bit weird. But it's almost like when you're asleep and there's a point when you go from sleep to awake, but there is either like a gradual wake up or like suddenly someone shakes you and you're awake. I think with me, it was just more of a gradual thing, but then things like that happened that just reaffirm it for me.
Yeah, I've always struggled with a lot of this stuff in my own life, and I think for me, I rebelled hard against a lot of the sort of the religious stuff, and then anything that was even remotely sort of spiritual, I just threw into the same bucket for better or for worse. And it's only sort of been in sort of more recent years where the old word maturity kicks in, and you start to sort of have a little bit more awareness of the world around you and just seeing how things tick. That I wouldn't say that I'm spiritual myself, but I'm certainly more open to these things than I ever have before. And I think just listening to the way that you describe that story and the events that happened, I mean, it's just, regardless of anything else, it's so hard for anybody to think otherwise, or to be in a different position and say, well, they're just all lucky coincidences. It's not just, if it's one coincidence, that's one thing, but then to have all those things that all intertwine and work and lock in together, and it's all coming from symbolic places as well. It's got meaning attached to it. It's just, that's something for me. I sort of look at it and I go, well, fuck, I can't sort of, sit here stubborn and just think that life is completely logical and rational all the time. It's not.
No, it can be. It can be that way. I think as human beings, that's it. That's where we're at. Is we have periods in our life where you use your logical brain a lot, and you have periods in your life where your intuition and your gut and your feelings, kick in. And I think it ebbs and sways a fair bit. And some people will never use their gut or intuition and never have to, and they live a quite happy, fulfilling life. Other people don't use their logical brain very much, and they just go on feelings and emotions the whole time. And I think there's every one of us is somewhere within the two spectrums.
Yeah, definitely. And and in some cases bouncing between them, like just depending on the circumstance and the period of time in someone's life, it's a case of leaning heavy in one direction or the other, or having some degree of balance along the way as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm lucky enough. I just had my wedding anniversary. Through all of these things that happened to me, and I've been married for 26 years, and the thing that I laugh with my wife the most about is the fact that we were that excited to have our first child, and the due date that my daughter Kiara, who's now 23, she was due on the exact same date as the first show on the Ozzy Osbourne tour that we were given the opening slot to. And the nurses at Shellharbour Hospital, I could probably say this now, it's 23 years later, brought my wife's birth forward a week so that we could have the baby and I could still do the show.
I love it. Just to make sure that everything falls into place just perfectly.
And just after the show, I played because to me, when I was a kid, right, one of the biggest goals when you were in a band, the thing that you'd always get excited about is, I wish I could play at Sydney Entertainment Centre. I mean, it's not even there anymore. It was like, I really wish I'm going to make it in a band if I played at Sydney Entertainment Centre. It doesn't matter if you've sold no CDs ever, but if you played at Sydney Entertainment Centre, you'd made it in a band. And I finally got there and played with Ozzy Osbourne, and I had a daughter a week before it, and I was on the highest of highs you could imagine. I come off stage, I was signing autographs, I was living the dream, the life, whatever you want to call it, everything at once, and it was quite emotional. And then I realised, I looked at my watch and was like, I've got the whole tour to watch Ozzy's band, so I'm going to have to sneak off a bit early because my wife's now back at home after watching the show, and I really want to see my new daughter. So quickly got in the car and drove home, get in the house. I want to go in and give Kiara a kiss. I was so proud. And then my wife goes, "Since how you haven't been home for a few days or a week, the dog shit needs picking up." So less than 2.5 hours after I blitzed it on stage to a packed house with Ozzy Osbourne, watching it on the stage, I was in the backyard in my thongs and shorts picking up dog shit. And it kind of sums up what it's like being in a band. You go from the elation of kicking all these goals and feeling like you're something special to the reality, the harsh reality of what everything's all about.
Well, it's kind of like what I said at the start, that little story of my perception of you guys as a band rocking up in the taxi. And, for me, a very sort of limited knowledge of what the reality of band life is, and obviously later on down the track, that was a big slap in the face for me. But I love that. I think it's one of those things that keeps people humble, and it's the humility that's attached to it. And I think that's also what keeps good bands going over time. I think that's what keeps bands sort of chugging away, where there's a level of sort of humility that's attached to it, and being humble and sort of being reminded of where you're coming from and the reality. I mean, because I guess, the stereotypical rock star sort of stuff that we all grew up with, and sort of looking at the records and seeing the videos and all that kind of stuff is, it's very unnatural. It's an unnatural lifestyle. And I think for people that do come into a band situation expecting that, it could be a harsh reality that they face when they realize that it's not always, the old stereotypical sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny how the age and the maturity changes things, because when you're young and you're playing in bands, you see these other bands and you're always trying to outdo each other. I'm going to blow them away and they're going to blow us away. We're going to, and you're all pushing to get as good as you can get. And you see the other bands that are around you almost like a competition, and they see you as competition, and the whole thing drives. As you get a bit older, you start to realize you're all just doing the same thing as each other. And then the respect grows over time, and you realize that you're not competing with each other, that you really, you're all in it together. And where you might have been, someone might have got a support, you thought, fuck, why did they get it? We're better than them. Or why did we get it? And when you get that bit older, and you actually start to go, oh, I'm really happy that they're still here, and I'm really, really happy that they're still doing it. And it's nice for me when I catch up with guys that used to play Metal for the Brain with, or people we shared the stage with when we were in our early 20s, and then you see them now, and they're still playing music, and it's that you almost have like this overwhelming warmth and love for seeing them still doing it, and you start to realize, what, I'm just lucky that my health has held up, and that my finances have held up, that I could actually have those experiences in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that because I've certainly gone through that myself, where you go from a very sort of competition perspective, and everything's a threat. Every other band's a threat to your opportunities. And so when somebody else gets something, you're sort of going, well, what did we do wrong? Or what did they do right? Or who do they know that we don't know? Or whatever it might be. And it's a very sort of, and I think an element of competition is healthy, but I think when it becomes obsessive, then it becomes a problem. And that's where it destroys, people and bands. But over the years, like a lot of people, you start to realize that those threats aren't real. The threats are yourself and your own mentality.
Yeah, that's right.
And you realize that there's more than enough opportunities to go around. You can carve out your own niche and find that comfortable spot where, you start to embrace music as a part of your life rather than it being this quest to try and get to a particular goal and try and do it ASAP. It's a case of, well, this is my life. This is a part of my life, and it's part of who I am.
Absolutely. And then you get that step further then, where you see the real threat is like losing someone in your family, or having a pandemic take away your ability to go to a funeral. It's those things that are the big threats, where music is just like a little part of your life that you're lucky enough to enjoy. One
thing that I've been talking about quite a bit with people on the podcast over the past few months has been the last 12 months with all the COVID stuff and bands just stopping in their tracks. They can't do anything, and resorting to trying to keep things moving online and just keeping the content going and sharing stuff and all that sort of stuff and doing live streams. But the traditional way of getting out there and playing and touring has certainly been paused, and for a lot of people it's going to be paused for quite some time. And the thing that's been a common theme that's come out of these discussions has been that attack on the identity of people that have put all their eggs into one basket to be that guy in that band and to be that musician. And that's been really challenging for a lot of people, where they've been forced to have to stop and go, well, if this doesn't come back for whatever reason, then what do I do with my life? Who am I? Who are people going to refer to me as? And I think an interesting thing that you sort of highlighted, and I sort of get a bit of a gist just being connected with you for the past several years as well, is that you are somebody that likes to get involved in a lot of different things. You've got interests in a whole range of different areas, and that's been the case for quite some time. Did you ever have a transitional moment where you had sort of mentally put your eggs in one basket as the guy in Segression and had sort of thrown so much of your mental energy into being that guy and being part of that identity, and then sort of getting to a point realizing that this might be a fleeting moment and you might have to sort of think about other things in your life?
No, when I'm doing Segression, and when I'm writing a song, or when I'm rehearsing, or when I'm playing, I've got all my eggs in that basket whilst I'm doing it. When I'm doing a tattoo for somebody, I'm putting all my eggs into that basket. When I'm going for a run, I put all my eggs into the one basket. But I don't do that all the time. I find that I have always enjoyed lots of different parts of my life. I love being a dad to my girls. I love being a husband. I love tattooing. I love painting. I love running. I do what I do 100% whilst I'm doing it, but I don't just do that. I was never just Chris from Segression. Sometimes I'd have to refer to myself, like if I was talking to someone, I'd ring up for an interview with, Hot Metal Magazine. I'd say, "Hi, Jeremy, it's Chris from Segression." But I'd never go out of my way and, run into somebody and go, "Hi, I'm Chris from the band Segression." It was just, I was lucky enough to be Chris and lucky enough to play in a band called Segression, but it never defined me. I don't know why. I threw everything into Segression while I'm doing it. Even if I go back now and re-record some songs or write some new songs or even go to rehearsal, I do it to the best of my ability with all of my energy and soul. But I just don't become that singularly.
Do you think, I mean, you've been married for would you say 26 years? So that's
Yeah.
been a long time. And do you think that sort of some of those other major milestones in your life have probably helped you in that respect, where you can, in a way, you can't afford to just be Chris from Segression. You are, a husband as well, and growing a family, creating a family. Do you think that sort of has helped as well to sort of keep you balanced with a number of different things that are of importance in your life?
I think so. It's always nice when you've got someone that you share your experiences with, whether it's a wife, whether it's a child, whether it's a sibling, whether it's your parents. You always look for someone to share. It's horrible, and I find myself spending time on social media because I see people that I feel like they don't have someone to share their time with. So if someone inboxes me, I try to make the effort, to inbox them back as quickly as I can. Obviously, you're not sort of able to live on there all the time, but there are a lot of people out there that don't have somebody to share that with. So I like to try and if I can do that for as many people as possible, I like to do that. It makes me feel good. But in terms of my own relationship, my wife and I balance each other really well. She has completely different interests to me, although she tolerates a lot of my interests. She, like not many people would have the baby induced so that their husband could go on tour. So but she does remind me of some of the boundaries that I have pushed from time to time. But at the same time, it's about, I like for her to have the best life possible as well. So I take an interest in what she wants. And as you get older, your desires and your ambitions both change, and hopefully you both keep going in the same direction. And we're lucky enough that we have. But yeah, I guess it's a funny thing when you get a little bit older, you look at everything a little bit differently. And at the time, I didn't realize probably how lucky I was to have someone who was so supportive with me. And it's something that you definitely appreciate when you're older. So I don't know. I know you've been married now for a little while yourself, and I guess it's the same thing when you're first together. You see your relationship one way, and then once you go through the years together, you start to appreciate everything a little bit more.
Yeah, I remember early days, or the first couple of years of spending time with my now wife, and the band was always number one for me, and trying to have that conversation in a way that wasn't going to cause problems was a really difficult thing. And I knew that I was wrong, but I hadn't quite got to that stage where I could accept the change in my life and understand that I could actually still have it wasn't one or something else. I could do everything and do it to the best of its ability, and nothing would be neglected. But that was a real struggle for me at the time to get used to, because I realized that the world doesn't just revolve around me, and that's it's such an immature way of thinking about the world, but that's where I was. And I think I certainly put my eggs in one basket for probably a good decade, where it was a case of just whatever I was doing in my life, if it wasn't band related, it was something that was for the band. I would walk away from a job if the job wasn't allowing me to do what I wanted to do for the band. It was every sacrifice, like other relationships leading up to where I am now, were all sacrificed as a result of the band, and it was always for the greater good of this bigger goal. And I could get away with it for a while there, but as you get older and then you meet somebody that you don't want to let go of, you realize that you need to widen the lens a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, I get it too, because there were periods where I didn't do anything other than Segression. Like I moved overseas, left my wife and daughter to it, to fend for themselves for a little bit while I toured and recorded. That was a difficult time, because you miss them and you worry for them and you want them to still have a good life, and you're busy doing your thing. So I've been in that world as well. It's challenging, like you said, and there's probably times there where I thought, well, maybe I did put myself a little bit, further to the forefront of what I should have. Maybe I should have put my wife a bit more in front of what I did in the early days. But we're still here, and we still have a very strong relationship. And I guess if I think of it too much, maybe I think, well, I would wonder, okay, what would it be like if I didn't do those things? Would I resent her for that? Would I go, well, I didn't do those things because I put you first, and maybe then my relationship wouldn't have lasted? And it just comes back to that old thing that we talked about before, where, if you constantly are solving problems and thinking logically, or you just go with it, and what's kind of meant for you is meant for you. So I'm grateful for everything, and thankfully for me, my relationship survived through the years.
Yeah, definitely. There's a couple of things I want to quickly talk to you about. So one, you quickly mentioned it in passing before, but working as a tattoo artist, and it seems that you've been doing this for quite a few years, and I believe, your business is literally a family business, and it's not just a case of, owned by the family. You've pretty much got the majority of your family working there as well, which is incredible. But is it a case, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you'll just fill me in, but your father is a tattoo artist?
He's still a tattoo artist. My dad's 70. He's still at the top of his game.
Incredible.
He's still working big hours. And we're actually, now I've got both daughters in the studio with me, and it hasn't been announced yet, but I just signed on with the Sydney Tattoo Expo, so I'm going to do some judging for them at their expo when they relaunch in Sydney. So you get the premiere of this little thing that's happening.
Cool.
And we're also going to have a family booth up there with 6 artists working, which will be 4 of them being my immediate family, my wife and 2 daughters, and my dad's going to join us there. And we're going to do a 3-generational tattoo where I work on the piece with my dad and my daughters. And possibly my wife will stick something in there as well. So we're going to be doing something like that at the Sydney Tattoo Expo in October, as long as this COVID situation remains stable and it goes ahead.
That's incredible. It's obviously, I would assume that's how you came into it, is because of your father and what he was doing at the time, and that's obviously sort of led a semi-natural path for you to get into it, but then for that to extend to your family as well is absolutely incredible. Can I just ask, this might be a really silly question. I don't know the best way to, or a better way to ask it, but what do you think it is about doing tattoos that has become a magnet for your family? What is it?
I don't know. I really don't know. It's like my dad's done it. So I was the little kid sitting in the corner of the tattoo shop, and I was always not going to be a tattooist. So I went to school and I studied hard and went to uni and got a degree. And while I was doing all that and playing in bands, I needed to supplement my income. So I started cleaning in the shop. And then one day he just said to me, look, I'm getting that busy. You're going to have to tattoo. You're going to have to finish this piece for me and sit down and do it. So, and that was back in the days where this is a whole different podcast where we were lucky to have a phone in the tattoo shop, and then when I eventually introduced a computer in there, it was a trade secret. And so those were completely different days with a different atmosphere, and we don't know any different. My girls have grown up the same way. They're both 4 or 5 years old, sitting on my dad's knee doing tattoos on me, and and it's just been part of what we do. And my 2 daughters are probably more artistically in tune than what I was at their age. I sort of took more of a theoretical, mathematical approach to tattooing. I had to know how the needles worked, how the machines worked, and that was where I used my logical brain extensively to learn, where they're a bit more artistically natural. For them, tattooing was just like, okay, I can draw, I can paint, I can use crayons, I can use pastels. Now I'm going to use a tattoo machine. It's just a different medium to them. But they've grown up now in a world where the technology and the pigments and everything is at a level where you can do that, where when I first started, my dad gave me a machine and shook itself to pieces in my hand. I had to work out how to put it back together. You couldn't buy anything on the internet because the internet didn't actually exist. Yeah. So what you learned was from other tattooists who were, if you could convince them you're friends enough for them to share any sort of ideas with you, it was that sort of vibe. It was very pirate ship, very secretive society back then.
So I guess in a way it was probably just that family atmosphere that just sort of naturally became a magnet for everybody to sort of find an interest, just because you're around it so much, and you just sort of, people that you respect and you care for are immersed in something that they're passionate about, and I guess that naturally just rubs off on others.
Yeah, and I think like there's obviously something that draws you in, like it's something that drew me into music. So it's something that must draw people into art and draw people into tattooing, and maybe it's a genetic thing, or maybe it's just an energy or a spiritual thing. I don't really understand it myself, but my wife is a tattooist now for the last 14 years. She was always artistic. She sort of came into it having worked in a few different careers, but when we had children, she was, I don't know if it's the right way to put it, but we were a little bit more old-fashioned, where she wanted to make sure she was home for the kids up until they got to school. So she sort of took up tattooing and coming into the shop to help out once the girls got to an age where they started, preschool and kindergarten. We have a 4-year gap between the two girls, so she more became into the business when my youngest daughter sort of hit preschool age.
It just blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind. I mean, for you sort of being in the industry for the years that you have you seen another dynamic that's similar to your family dynamic, as far as, I mean, obviously there's family businesses that exist around the place, but is there anything that comes close to what you guys do as far as the number of family members that are all sort of under the one roof and all working together?
Well, the only thing that I can compare it to that people would perhaps relate to is if you got a cross between, I'm not saying that my family's in any way, shape or form famous or renowned or any of that. I'm not going there with that side of things. But if you were to get the Kardashians and cross them with the Osbournes and make it a little bit more dysfunctional, it's probably close to what it's like on a daily basis for us.
I love it.
And we've actually got a sign in the shop, to be honest. One of the customers noticed what it was like in there, because the girls are all quite good looking and I'm this ugly old man grumpy at the back of the shop. But they actually made a sign called the Randashians. So that sits in the shop now and holds the business cards. But yeah, it's definitely different. We do have to have our own space, and you do have times where your relationship's probably fractured a little bit. Like I know that there's been times when the relationship between my own parents and myself has been strained because it is business related, and it's hard to flick between the emotions of being family and running something that puts food on everyone's table.
Probably the last thing, just to sort of round off the chat and also a bit of the Segression talk. What's the status of the band? Is it something that's sort of one of those things that is just going to sort of exist, and when the time's right, you guys might get together and do some stuff again, or are there plans? What's the go at the moment?
One of our members was given a devastating diagnosis 2 and a bit years ago. He's extremely sick. So he was given at one point 24 hours to live, and he survived it. And he's had an extensive surgery and extensive treatment. It's been a horrible couple of years for him, but his health looks to be stable-ish. So I have had the conversation as to whether or not we can do a couple more shows, maybe when COVID settles down towards the end of the year, maybe early next year, and then obviously then do some songs and record. And we've recorded together, so he can actually play. It's just whether he can stand up and do a full live set is another story. But that's where the status of the band's at. And it's my brother, my founding member, Sven. So it's if his health is right, then we'll go full steam ahead and do whatever we can. But I don't know if I'm actually strong enough mentally and emotionally to do anything without him.
Yeah. And no doubt that's understandable given the history, given everything that's happened over the years. And I guess probably the peace of mind as well is, I mean, the last thing you want to do is put pressure on a situation as well to try and do something. And I mean, you guys have achieved so much over the years. I mean, it's an incredible career and legacy that you guys have left behind, with so many bands sort of using some of your stories and blueprints to sort of, open doors for themselves. And I think you guys are probably part of some of those bands who just opened up internationally as well, where, those networks started to solidify, because, for a long time there, it was, getting international bands here was a diamond, it was a difficult thing. And and then, the gates started to open and got better. And that part of that was the reputation that, bands had when, internationals came over here and leaving lasting impressions, and word would travel. And so I think what you guys have done over the years is probably underrated in the way of really sort of making it a lot easier for the bands that came after.
Yeah, I think we just did what we could do at the time. We always like to be able to give opportunities to as many people as possible, and we always made sure that when we toured on our own right that we had plenty of slots for young bands to experience playing live. So we were conscious of that at the time, but it'd be nice for us to go and do at least one or two more tours. And I think physically and musically we're still up for it. It's just whether Sven is. Like, I know that my own physical health, I'm probably at the strongest. My voice is fine. I still play a lot, so I know technically I wouldn't want to do this and it not be good. Or at the level of which we're known for. So if we were going to do it, got back together and rehearsed, and it was not where we thought it would be, I just wouldn't do it. I'd just be like, okay, yeah, we've had our time, we're done. But I think our drummer we're lucky because Ads is a fair bit younger than us, and he's still really physically fit, and he's a great drummer. So I think that's the linchpin of it. I don't think being metal, it's very difficult for a 50 or 60-year-old man to be as physically fit enough to do what we do on their instrument. Different for a bass player or a guitarist, I think. But yeah, it's the physicality as you get a bit older, and just making sure that you're up for, you've got enough energy to put in that show.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll let time do what it needs to do, and hopefully it'll lead in a positive direction. But yeah, as I said, I think what you guys have done and achieved over the years, it's just it. You guys have already won, from being able to sort of do all the things that you've done. So, I mean, it's fantastic. And then anything that does happen in the future is a bonus on top. So, at least from my perspective anyway. So it's...
that's really kind, man. I really appreciate it.
Alrighty, folks. Now, if you're not familiar with Segression or you want a little bit of a refresh, I encourage you to go to andysocial.net or andydowling.net. Click through to the show notes for this episode, and I'll have some YouTube videos in there. I'll have links to the social media platforms, the streaming services. I'll have links to Chris, of course, and his tattoo studio, and everything that we discussed will be in the show notes over there. And wherever you're listening to this podcast through right now, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, YouTube, blah, 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 in the description, there'll be a bunch of clickable links in there as well. So make sure you click through, follow the band, go and listen to the tunes, enjoy them, and reach out to Chris. Most importantly, reach out to Chris, let him know what you thought of the episode. I'm sure he'd be absolutely stoked to hear from you, as well as everybody who's been on the podcast for the past 5.5 years. 272. I had to look down on my page to see what number I wrote down. 272 episodes. It's just been an absolute wild ride. And actually, just a quick side note. I know I'm going to be rambling on here in this outro, and I'll try to rein it in. Rein it in, Andy. A thing I mentioned on social media the other day was that this podcast has been a little bit like a back catalogue, like an album collection, and it's been amazing to see people digging into the depths of the podcast and not just treating this as, only listening to episodes that are recent and that's it. There are so many amazing guests and stories that I've been able to capture over the past 5.5 years and past, close to 300 episodes. Oh my God. And it's amazing. Some of this stuff is timeless as far as, insights and, learnings and lessons along the way from amazing people that have achieved a lot over the years. But it's also a bit of a time capsule. It's captured moments in time where people have been talking about what's been happening in their life at that particular point in time, reflecting back on their life to date. And for a couple of people in particular, they're no longer around. They've passed on, and I'm just incredibly thankful that I managed to have these amazing chats, and they're recorded, and they're sitting out there to be enjoyed for as long as possible, as long as I can possibly keep this podcast up and running. And those two people in particular is Arnie Ulbrich, who is from Kickstart Studios and played in a great Aussie band in the 70s called Hard Grind, and he's an integral part of Dungeon and Lord down in Wollongong. He was on episode 3. incredible chat with him and Peter Hobbs from Hobbs Angel of Death. I think episode 137, I think, off the top of my head, it's going to be one in the 130s. It's in that gap, in that sort of bracket there. And another great chat with an amazing person and some incredible stories there. So go back and listen to those two in particular. But please dig into these episodes. There's so many great stories in there. And although some of them are years removed, they still are absolutely fantastic to listen to. And I know there's a bunch of you that have been getting a lot of value out of some of these old episodes as well. So just please go back and dig into the depths of the podcast and reach out to these guests, the guests who are still with us, and let them know what you thought of these episodes. I know that a lot of these people will be absolutely stoked to hear from you and just be blown away to say that, you were listening to episode, 31 or 102 or 69. And all these episodes, I'm sure like years and years down the track that people would just be absolutely blown away to know that their stories are still being listened to. So I encourage you to go digging for gold. There's plenty of gold back there. So before we wrap it up, of course, patreon.com/Andy Dowling. My focus for this year is to get as many of you people to join Patreon as possible, especially the $1 tier. $1 a month, nothing. Set and forget. You won't even notice it. It's an amazing way to support me. It is the best way to give me encouragement, to keep me motivated. And the fact that I've got such a great Patreon community already is just incredible. And it's the reason why Andy Social is still chugging away, firing on all cylinders, doing 2 episodes a week in 2021. It's just incredible. And it is because of the Patreon community. So a massive thank you to everybody that's in the community and is supporting me and this little journey that I've been on for the past several years and will continue to do for hopefully many years to come as well. So go to patreon.com/Andy Dowling. If you want access to exclusive things such as merch and the Patreon podcast episode that comes out each week, there are additional tiers there as well that you can get access to that stuff as well. So go over and check it all out over at patreon.com/Andy Dowling. I think that's about it, folks. Let's wrap it up. Enough fucking waffling on from me. Next week's episode, I have absolutely no idea. I'm literally pulling names out of a hat at the moment. That's just how I'm rolling. And why not? Let's keep each other on our toes. So until then, take care, folks, and ta-ta.